Welcome, everyone, to this special live taping of the Intersectionality Matters podcast and the 49th episode of Under the Blacklight. We're coming together today to confront the monumental consequence of the Supreme Court's death knell to the Voting Rights Act, the crown jewel of the civil rights movement, and arguably its most successful achievement. The Voting Rights Act was successful because it addressed the core function of allocating power in society, providing the potential for African Americans in particular to exercise that power to protect, to advance, and to fully participate in American society. Make no mistake, this was not an ordinary case of narrow interpretation. The court is not choosing a less expansive route or faithfully executing some limited notion of legal restraint. This is a court that is actively promoting an ideology that is as consequential and as damaging as the 19th century Redeemer Court, which gave us the civil rights cases, which gave us Plessy versus Ferguson, which utterly destroyed Reconstruction. We simply cannot attempt to normalize what this court did last week in the Callais decision. We have to push back in every conceivable way. This is an effort to establish white dominance as the first position, and against this twisted logic that somehow anything departing from that dominance is racial discrimination. Public acceptance of this lie, it's a full reversal of reality, is exactly why Black people existed under racial tyranny ever since Reconstruction was ended. We had 8 years of Reconstruction and we had 7 decades of racial tyranny. I've said many times that this assault on woke, it's not a battle for 2026. It's not a battle for 2028. It is a battle for the rest of the century and beyond. So our struggle is real. And our struggle is not just with the Supreme Court or even with the MAGA ideology that has infected it. Our struggle is with others closer to home, those who've been reluctant to foreground the anti-Blackness that fuels MAGA politics. It is with those in the Democratic Party who believe that their path to regaining power rests on suppressing these issues and who signal their willingness to throw Black, brown, and other marginalized voters way under the bus in their request to gain power. We have seen this story before, and we know exactly how it ends if we don't talk back. So, since I've got plenty of talking back to do today, I'm going to pass the mic to my good friend to moderate, president of ASALA and host of Today with Dr. K, Dr. K. Weiss Whitehead. K, it's on you.
Thank you so much, Professor Crenshaw. As always, it is an absolute pleasure to be here with you, to have conversations that matter. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of Under the Blacklight. We'd also like to give a very special welcome to all of my listeners from Today with Dr. K who are listening in on this conversation as well. We are joined with thinkers and advocates who refuse to remain silent as the Second Reconstruction is dismantled. Now, originally, this platform was set aside to have a conversation with Professor Crenshaw to celebrate the release of her new memoir, Backtalker, which officially drops tomorrow. We're excited because she's going to be on Today with Dr. K on Wednesday, joining us right here in Baltimore City. But last Wednesday, everything changed when the Supreme Court handed down its decision effectively eradicating the strength of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So today, we have repurposed the original book launch into both a requiem for the Voting Rights Act and an urgent call to back talk to the bench. Folks, we must all be back talkers now. So, in actual fact, it's not a repurposing at all, because Backtalker is a call to action against precise the deterioration of our nation's commitment to equity. It's the same thing, actually. Last Wednesday, the Supreme Court simply gave us Exhibit A, and what we must backtalk against. In the opening pages of her book, Professor Crenshaw writes, being a backtalker is like being lactose intolerant. There are things I cannot digest, and to accept anything close to second class status as the price of belonging sickens me. That visceral refusal to digest our own subjugation is exactly what we need to channel right now. We are witnessing an authoritarian takeover that relies on our exhaustion and on our silence. But we know silence is a death knell. Being a backtalker is now a democratic necessity. And together we are considering these two texts together, the course decision and Professor Crenshaw's memoir. The object of backtalking is the dominant anti-democratic narrative that would say that race doesn't matter, that would say civil rights are anti-white, that anti-blackness is no longer a thing. Today, we bring together both of those texts to sharpen how we understand what the object of our collective backtalking must be, what we stand to lose if we don't, and what we must demand of our allies. And so without further ado, I'm thrilled to be joined by Professor Dr. Carol Anderson, acclaimed historian, professor of African American Studies at Emory University, and author of One Person, No Vote: How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. Welcome, Dr. Anderson.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I want to welcome back to the stage Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw, co-founder and executive director of AAPF and author of Backtalker, an American Memoir, dropping tomorrow.
Thank you, Kay. Thank you for taking it away.
Absolutely. And I'm so happy that we join as our third person on the panel, Tim Wise, AAPF Senior Fellow and author of Colorblind, The Rise of Post-Racial Politics and the Retreat from Racial Equity. Hello, Tim. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Good to see you again, Dr. K.
Absolutely. So before we dive into the legal mechanics of the decision in round one, I want to ground us in the sheer human impact of this moment. You know, we often jump straight into the analysis, but we are people first here. So when the news broke about this ruling, effectively erasing a newly won majority Black congressional district, what was your immediate emotional response? So why don't we just do a quick roundtable and check the temperature? Kim, let's start with you. And I want to split this first question. First, we are here celebrating the incredible achievement of your new memoir, Backtalker, which officially drops tomorrow. I feel like it's a new baby coming out. We're so happy about it. How does it feel, as a two-part question, how does it feel to bring this book, this baby, into the world at this exact moment, and at the same time, having to hold that celebration alongside the unraveling of our movement? What was your immediate emotional response?
Kay, that metaphor that you just used actually puts a point to it. It does feel like having a baby in the middle of a tornado, a hurricane, and an earthquake. All of these things happening at the same time. I'm incredibly proud that Backtalker is finally coming out after, quite a journey from the moment it was conceptualized in the midst of the moment of racial reckoning to the full-scale retreat on that racial reckoning that's happening right now. When I heard about the opinion it dropped, of course, those of us who've been watching it were worried that this was going to happen. We knew that it was possible and potentially even likely, but still, my response was just blinding rage. Um, it just felt like the myth of Sisyphus. Right? We have to push this boulder all the way up, and the things that we have to show in order to win fair representation. We've got to show, how uh, the electoral process doesn't serve us well. We had to have evidence over the course of history to even get the Voting Rights Act. And when we're finally at a moment when there is a possibility for some representation, and let me say, it's not even proportional representation. This is what the MAGA people are saying, but some representation that becomes too much. And
Mhm.
then it's just rolling, back down the hill again. So, it's incredibly infuriating and disappointing and also explanatory. One of the things I write about in Backtalker is how when Black people don't have fair representation, we are subject to the will and the power of majorities to prefer their interests over ours. That's why urban renewal, for example, was so devastating to Black communities. We were outvoted. We didn't have representation. So that meant nothing was secure. It meant that they could take our property, they could take our future, they could make it harder for us to pass intergenerational wealth and opportunity to subsequent generations. And so to know that we're in a moment where we haven't escaped that risk, we haven't escaped that vulnerability, and that in many ways we're going right back to it. It is enough to make you want to holler. But what we need to do is talk back. So that meant
Thank you for that. Professor Anderson, I'll come to you. I saw a response along kind of an intergenerational thread from my parents really weeping about what was lost to my sons trying to understand how we got here. So you had the range of emotions. So what was your immediate emotional response?
Anger,
Mm.
pure, pure anger. Anger at the lies being told in a judicial decision that talked about that racism really wasn't there anymore. It wasn't like it was in 1965. Um, the erasure of all of that blood, all of that struggle, all of that strategy. Um, and I think about Reverend C.T. Vivian, who was on the steps of the courthouse where Sheriff Jim Clark hit him and knocked him down the steps. And Reverend C.T. Vivian popped right back up and said, "We are willing to be beaten for democracy." And you begin to think about that. We are willing to be beaten for democracy. Those folks were beaten. They were killed for democracy. And basically, what this decision did was it, just like those executive orders we've been dealing with, it erased that history. It erased that history and treated that history as if it had not happened, and treated it as if the ongoing racism that is now race neutral but racially targeted is not ongoing. So this is why we're seeing, so what happened after Shelby County is what we're seeing right after Calais. It is just, and so we're in the midst of another wave of what I call white rage. And that white rage is when you see where African Americans gain some sense of their citizenship rights. You see a wave of policies coming through to undermine those citizenship gains. And this is what we saw happening after the Civil War with Reconstruction, how that got just how the Supreme Court jumped in there and said, no, 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 we're not going to do that 13th Amendment thing. We're not going to do that 14th Amendment thing. We're not going to do that 15th Amendment thing. And it took a civil rights movement in the middle of the 20th century after the US had fought Nazis
Mm.
in order to make democracy even almost quasi viable by 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. And so it was just anger, just washing that history away.
Thank you so much, Carol, for that. Tim, I come to you
Mhm.
because we've been watching this. So we knew that this boulder, with use the analogy that Kim gave around Sisyphus, this boulder was on its way down and has been since 1966. They've been challenging the Voting Rights Act. So here we are back at the bottom again in terms of thinking about this. What was your immediate emotional response?
Well, for me, it was just the weight of realizing that not even the most basic of civil rights protections was going to be safe any longer. For most of my life, things like affirmative action, that had always been contested ground, right? I think we all knew we've been holding our breath, all of us, expecting the court for like 20 years or more to do what they finally did in SFFA v. Harvard on several prior occasions. We sort of figured that was coming. But something like the Voting Rights Act previously had seemed so sacred that in 1980, when the Supreme Court had issued a ruling in a way that seriously hampered its enforcement, both Democrats and Republicans got together and said, no, we're going to fix this. That's when they amended the act in 1982 to prevent exactly what the court just did from happening. So you'd think it was sacred. I mean, this is part of the civil rights revolution that happens after Selma. It happens after the Edmund Pettus Bridge, after everything that we learned about in school as one of the most important freedom struggles in history. This was the part that was settled. We thought this is the part that everyone supposedly celebrates in January for MLK Day. This is the part that supposedly gives everyone the warm fuzzies, right? And yet now it's contested ground again. So it hits different because it is such a direct slap in the face to Fannie Lou Hamer, to Amzie Moore, to Anita Blackwell, to James Reeb, to Viola Liuzzo, and all of the folks who fought and oftentimes died to ensure its passage. To me, it felt like the court had doused our heroes in gasoline and lit them on fire. That's what it
Mm.
Ooh, thank you for that, Tim. I will add heroes and sheroes and say it's slap in the face to our own grandmothers, because I'm sure Carol and Kim and I can sit back and talk about stories of our grandmothers going and trying to vote. Thank you all for sharing that. I think it's important that we hold the space for the anger, for the rage, as Carol said, but also for the sadness of realizing what was lost in this moment. So let us transition into round one and explicitly talk about the Callais decision alongside Backtalker. And so, Carol, I want to turn back to you because a core observation in Backtalker is how the law is frequently used to rationalize and structure racial hierarchy, while placing impossible burdens of proof on marginalized people who try to challenge. Now, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the one they've been going after, was designed specifically to pierce through that by looking at the actual effects of minority vote dilution. What historic injustices was Section 2 built to guard against, and how does the Callais ruling use the exact legal traps that Kim warns us about to insult the legacy of those who fought and bled and went to jail and died for our democracy?
I think about it in terms of Georgia had what was called the county unit system. And what the county unit system did was it placed a number of points, kind of like the Electoral College. It placed a number of points just given the kind of entity you were. If you were an urban county, if you were a rural county, if you were a mid-sized county. And you had to have so many points in order to win statewide election. What happened then was that Atlanta, as big as Atlanta was only worth 6 points.
Mm.
The mid-sized counties were worth 4 points, and the small rural counties were worth 2. You just had to win all of the rural counties, and then you would win statewide election. And so we have had instances where those who did not win the popular vote actually won the gubernatorial election, like in 1946 with Gene Talmadge. What that is designed to do, it is designed to dilute Black political power. So it doesn't matter how many folks in Atlanta, Black folks in Atlanta, vote for a candidate. It only is worth 6 points.
Mm.
Tennessee had the same kind of thing where you had massive power being given to the rural counties and very little power being given to the votes coming out of Nashville and Memphis. And so you would end up with these legislatures that are beholden to these rural counties, these kind of regressive rural counties, and making sure that the policies match what that constituency wants. In a series of Supreme Court decisions that ended up with, it's the Baker decision and I believe the Reynolds decision that gives us one person, one vote, saying that you have to, you cannot have this massive disparity based on where you live, because where you live has so much to do with race. There's almost what do you call it? It's almost synonymous. And so one person, one vote coming out of these decisions was supposed to be the rule of law. That is the rule of law. And then Section 2 was to deal with making sure you didn't have these county unit systems anymore, making sure you didn't have this kind of disparity where white rural counties have enormous power and urban areas that are overwhelmingly Black have basically no power because you have legislatures then that are not addressing the needs of a sizable portion of your population. And this is why when you look at the South, the old Confederacy, this is where you see lower educational attainment, higher infant and maternal mortality rates. This is where you see the refusal to expand Medicaid. This is where you see the kinds of harsh penalties for being on welfare. And so you have people who are working 2 and 3 jobs who cannot get the health care that they need. And so you have these policies coming in because you have this massive imbalance in our state legislatures. And so Section 2 was designed to deal with that kind of Black vote dilution. And what the Supreme Court just did was to reverse all of that and put that back on the table so we can begin to just reinforce the massive inequities and the massive policy inequities and the results of those inequities into this system, particularly as America becomes more demographically diverse.
I'm glad you put that on the table, Carol. I'm going to take a quick moment and just follow up with you on that, because we know from history that retrenchment moves fast. We saw it after the Shelby County decision in 2013, which immediately was followed by a flood of discriminatory voting laws. Now, in the wake of Callais, we're already seeing red states. They're pretty much at the starting line to see who can go first and who can move as fast as possible. From Florida to North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, Tennessee, they're all there waiting to go fast and be first, trying to redraw these congressional maps. Can you imagine, just for a moment, maybe out loud, what is going to happen next based upon how quickly these legislatures are moving?
I think that what's going to happen is that you're going to see these states figure out how to basically only have like one area, one blue spot, one blue spot where Black folks can have an opportunity to get a representative. And so you see that map that they're testing out in Florida, where you only have little blue spots and then it's just basically all red. That is the goal. That is the goal. That's what Tennessee is going to try. That's what Louisiana is going to try. It is like, how do we make sure that these folks have no opportunity to have a representative that will support them, that will listen to them, that cares about what their needs are, that cares about their concerns, that will create policies that will benefit. And let me be clear, it's not just benefiting Black folks. So what these policies will do, they benefit everybody. So when we have a viable democracy, it benefits everybody. When we have access to quality healthcare, it benefits everybody. When we have quality education, it benefits everybody. When we have worker rights, labor rights, it benefits everybody. And so casting this as only benefiting Black folks is not accurate, but you can begin to see the kind of anti-Blackness that is buried deep into this policy, that if Black folks can get some benefits from it, we don't want it. And this is why we consistently have problems in getting things like universal health care. And so having politicians in place so this allows them to pick their politicians, to pick their voters, instead of voters picking who their politicians will be. That's what this is designed to do.
Thank you so much, Carol. I immediately thought it was the last one. I'm like, you know what? Being a backtalker, for me, benefits everybody. We can always talk about being a backtalker, which means, Kim, I'm returning to you. Because in this case, the court struck down a majority Black district by claiming that race predominated the map-making process, effectively weaponizing the concept of colorblindness. Now, in Backtalker, you observe how critical race theory emerged specifically to counter this kind of neutral legal logic that actually maintains racial hierarchy. Can you connect your observations in the book about how the law masked white supremacy through colorblindness directly to the court's logic in the Callais decision?
Yeah. I've debated, Kay, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, that happenstance of the book coming out in the middle of this show. And I think because this case is so raw, it's such an illustration of the mobilization of this ideology of colorblindness to be an alibi for, a protector of, an insulator of white supremacy, that, it kind of speaks for itself. I think one of the things that is important for us to remember, that even at the end of the first Reconstruction, when white legislatures went about the business of disenfranchising Black people, even then they tried to use colorblind, frameworks to do it. The grandfather clause, for
Mhm.
example, is colorblind. It just worked because at the time, every Black person's grandfather, in the South was a slave, was not voting. The fact that they thought that that was an effective constitutional way to go about what they were trying to do, which is push all Black people out of any exercise of political power, gives you a sense of how powerful it is to focus simply on one small dimension of the policy and practice, fully well knowing what the distributional consequences of that might be. So it's the same with respect to the poll tax, and it's the same with respect to literacy clauses, and same with respect to guessing how many marbles are in a bowl. It is putting the discretion and the decision making by law in the hands of people who you can count on to exercise white supremacist values in executing an electoral system. What was brilliant about the Voting Rights Act is that it said, look, it doesn't really matter what particular policy that you're going to put in place after the last one got struck down. What we're focusing on is political power. We're focusing on is the ability of communities of color to elect someone of their choice. So whatever way you go about trying to rob us of the power that we should have to elect someone of our choice, that is subject to legal prohibition. Well, now what this court is effectively saying is that that guarantee, that very practice of ensuring that marginalized communities have the ability to elect someone of their choice is itself discriminatory when race is taken into account to remedy the racial marginalization. It's as though racism comes into the conversation not in setting up the system, not in making sure that people who've been locked out of the system continue to be locked out of the system, not when one party actually becomes the party of racial exclusion. Those aren't the moments of racial discrimination, according to this court. The moment of racial discrimination is when we deem to do something about it. So it's basically turned anti discrimination and inclusive democracy on its head. The status quo that is racially exclusionary is the normal baseline, and anything that departs from that is the problem. So critical race theory is all about trying to show how neutrality, so-called neutrality, within systems that are already built in an exclusionary way will simply reproduce that discrimination, will produce that marginalization. It's more or less like a prism that helps you cut through all the ideology around colorblindness to see the racial power that is being exercised.
Wow, that's what happens when you have receipts. So we're going to do a quick sign off to the people who are listening through the radio. They'll be back after the break, but we're going to keep talking here because as Kim has laid out, you need receipts when you're going after folks in society. You have to be able to show them what they've already done and then help connect the dots. Now, Tim, I want to come to you to round out this section. Because in Backtalker, Professor Crenshaw details how structural racism is perpetuated when systems function to erase historical realities and demand impossible individualized proof of bias instead. Now, can you connect this observation from the book directly to the Callais decision, identifying how the court is using a new intent standard combined with weaponized colorblindness to make it harder to protect Black political representation?
Sure. Well, I mean, by mandating this intent standard, the court obviously is requiring plaintiffs to be able to prove that state lawmakers actively and purposely set out to discriminate on the basis of race. And as Kim notes in the book, and as I think sort of common sense tells us, that is an incredibly difficult hurdle because as those who amended the Voting Rights Act understood over 40 years ago, and as I think we all understand, politicians are generally pretty careful not to write down their racist intent in a memo or to record it on a voice note any longer, right? So that is where colorblindness does become a weapon. State lawmakers can use this race neutral language to completely dilute Black voting power and then hide behind the excuse that it was just politics, right? So if the court forces us to prove discriminatory intent while simultaneously embracing this colorblind legal framework that ignores the reality of systemic racism and tells us that, you know, systemic racism is something that can't be handled by the courts, which is what they've said for many years, then they have built this perfectly insulated system that makes protecting Black representation nearly impossible, right? Given this high correlation between race and partisanship, allowing so-called partisan gerrymandering, which the court says is totally fine, totally okay, that by definition results in racial vote dilution for Black folks and makes it pretty impossible for Black Southerners, even in large, contiguous, culturally similar urban areas like Memphis, New Orleans, Birmingham, Columbia, South Carolina, makes it very difficult, if not impossible, for them to be able to elect a candidate of their preference. And let me say this, to say that there's no racial intent there, so long as there is some non-racial motivation that can be pointed to, like partisanship, would be like saying that during segregation, the Dixiecrats were just using poll taxes or literacy tests to screen out poor people or people who couldn't read. And race was just this coincidental side note that they had oh my God, we didn't even think about that. Right. And let me say this, too, regardless of what they say, their intent is racial. And it's not just racial in effect, because if you're from the South or if you study this, you know, I've been white and I've been Southern all my life. Never lived anywhere but the South, been around a lot of white Southerners. And let me tell you something. If white Republicans' reason for being Republican is largely racial. And in the South, all of the poli-sci research says that's why white folks shifted to the Republican Party, is over civil rights and racial resentment. If the reason white Republicans in the South, not necessarily elsewhere, I won't say that's necessarily the case elsewhere, but if white Republicanism in the South is linked to racial resentment, then you cannot say that your desire to gerrymander districts to benefit Republicans in the South is just partisan politics. By definition, that also is racial. So in terms of intent, partisan intent is racial intent in the South. White Southerners do not think of the GOP or the Democrats in colorblind terms and haven't done so for at least a half a century. Now, sadly, the court will probably ignore what that social science research tells us on this matter, right? Even though the research can help us discern the real intent behind so-called partisan gerrymanders, because the court's only interest is maintaining white reactionary rule. So they're going to ignore the social science, but the social science makes it clear the motivation behind partisan Republican gerrymanders in the South is racial resentment, because that is what led white folks to abandon the Democrats and become Republicans down here in the first damn place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Tim Wise. We have our folks back from Today with Dr. K. That was Tim Wise. And I'm on with Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw. I'm on with Professor Carol Anderson for a very important Under the Blacklight by AAPF. So we're going to move to round two and dig deeper into the fallout. And Tim, I'm just going to stay with you for one more second here, because we're seeing these legal decisions happening at the exact same time as massive cultural and educational rollbacks. Backtalker itself is an effort to resist the weaponization of critical race theory and intersectionality. Can you link this ruling to the broader assault on the tools which have attempted to forge a multiracial democracy, from the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to the very knowledge and frameworks which challenge white supremacy?
Sure. I mean, it's all part of the same thing. As the U.S. has become less white, and as the culture of the nation has become more pluralistic and less insular, those white folks who have, you know, long taken our right to set the rules, dictate the norms, and govern over other people for granted, have moved into full-scale white lash, or as Carol said, white rage mode. And that means assaulting the civil rights infrastructure, obviously, as we've seen with this decision, but we've also seen it with a Justice Department that basically now ignores discrimination against Black and brown folk in favor of so-called reverse discrimination claims. We've seen it with the total collapse of fair housing enforcement. We've seen it with the sidelining of the Department of Education Civil Rights Division. But it also means erasing our ability to understand the historical precedent that they're following and that Kim referred to earlier, right? By removing the evidence from the crime scene that is America. Right. So they figure, well, if we can remove certain textbooks, if we can ban certain lessons from the classrooms, if we can alter museum exhibits, if we can censor historical monuments, then young people coming up will not realize that we are following the same playbook as our great, great, great grandparents in response to Reconstruction. Right. So changing the law is not enough for them. They also seek to change our memories. They seek to change our language. And so colorblindness becomes anti-racist, even if it locks in racial inequality. Anti-racism becomes racism simply because it points out the sociological reality of white dominance. And in this Supreme Court case, they are literally saying, this is the basic thing they're saying, that if you don't dilute Black voting power, you are diluting white voting power. And that is the thing which we cannot have. We cannot dilute white voting power, so we must dilute Black voting because Black voting power is the thing to be prohibited. And all of this, whether it's the censorship or the legal changes, is meant to do one thing above all else: to normalize inequality. The goal of this is to leave us with no explanation for racial disparities in income, wealth, health, education, or any category except for quote unquote natural differences between whites and Blacks, for instance. So if you get rid of the policies intended to equalize opportunity, and then you get rid of the frameworks to explain the inequalities between folks, right, then the only remaining explanation for those inequalities is what? Well, I guess those people just don't have what it takes to make it in the modern world. And then we just ignore the inequalities and we don't try to do anything about them. That is how the right intends to move, and they are moving from these more subtle dog whistle white supremacy into overt racial fascism. That's how we get from point A to point B if we don't push back.
Oh, thank you so much, Tim. You are really helping us, along with Professor Carol Anderson and Kimberlé Crenshaw, to put some language around what we've been feeling that we may not have been able to articulate. We just felt the anger and rage and the sorrow, but it's really very clear. And then, Carol, I want to come to you to build on Tim's answer, because the court's logic in Callais relies heavily on the idea that map makers must disentangle race from politics, and that protecting Republican incumbents is a valid non-racial reason to crack a Black district, right? So the idea of cracking and packing, you either pack them in there or you crack them open. So they want to crack a Black district. And this is 2026, by the way, that they're making this argument. So can you analyze how Black political representation has historically been marginalized under the guise of it being about politics or partisanship and not race?
You mean, how can I talk about the lie?
Yeah, just unpack the lie for us.
Because this is the lie. The lie is based on a sense of that Black people are not legitimate American citizens. And so therefore they do not have a legitimate right to vote, and therefore they do not have a legitimate right to representation. If we understand that that's foundational to the framing, we can begin to understand how these decisions, these court decisions, come through. So you had, like, back in right after Reconstruction, you had, I think it was the Reese case. I'm getting the name wrong, but he had paid his poll tax. He tried to pay his poll tax, and the city would not accept his poll tax. And then he went to go vote, and they told him, well, you got to pay your poll tax. He said, I tried to pay my poll tax, but they wouldn't accept my payment. And they're like, well, you haven't paid it. And so he's in this really awful catch-22 where he's trying to do what the law is telling him to do, but the law does not accept his payment. And so then the case goes to the court, and the court was like, well, the 15th Amendment, that's not really a right to vote. It's not a right to vote. But I thought the 15th Amendment was that the right to vote shall not be abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And they were like, yeah, and that didn't happen to you. And so then we get to the Williams decision. And that Williams decision is like 1898. So this is after Mississippi has implemented the Mississippi Plan that pulls together all these massive disfranchising projects, programs, policies, like the literacy test, like the poll tax. And then, so there was like the good character clause. And then eventually we would get the white primary. It had all of those components in there. And it was about, the fact was that you had more registered men, black men to vote than you had white men registered to vote, because this was before women had the right to vote. So you had more black men registered to vote than you had white men registered to vote. And they saw that as a corrupting influence. They saw that as voter fraud. And so it was like, how do we create a sanitized, how do we have election integrity? And so it's like removing those black men. And so each of those components led to, so in 1890, you had like 190,000 black men registered to vote. By 1892, you had 8,600 in Mississippi. So in 2 years, to go from 190,000 to 8,600, you can tell that this is a targeted hit. Well, the US Supreme Court looked at this in the Williams decision and said, no, because everybody has to pay the poll tax and everybody has to take the literacy test. This does not violate the 15th Amendment. Well, not everybody had to deal with hundreds of years of slavery. Not everybody had to deal with hundreds of years of unpaid labor. Not everybody had to deal with hundreds of years of being denied the right to education and then having to deal with these massively underfunded Black schools. And so when you're requiring literacy tests, when you're requiring poll taxes, when you're requiring the things that should be available basic because of societal policies, and the societal policies are vastly unequal, it begins to tell you that when you are creating access to the ballot box based on something that society has systematically determined that you shall not have.
Right.
Woo! I mean, it is like really it's beyond Sisyphean. It's beyond trying to push that rock up that hill. It is trying to push the hill up the hill. And
Right.
and that's what this is. And so it is saying that because Black people are not legitimate American citizens, they don't have the right to representation. So let me take us to the 2020 election. We remember that one well because Black folks came out in droves in the midst of a pandemic because they knew democracy was on the line. The response to that election was Newt Gingrich, they stole the election in Atlanta. They stole the election in Philadelphia. They stole the election in Detroit. They stole the election in Milwaukee. Notice he didn't say they stole the election in they stole the election in Utah.
Right.
So he was identifying these cities that have sizable Black populations as the site of the theft. And then you had a congressman out of Alabama basically saying, well, if you only count the legitimate votes, then Trump won. And again, so they're saying the quiet part out loud.
Yeah.
And so the legitimate votes mean those aren't the votes coming out of Atlanta. Those aren't the votes coming out of Philadelphia. Those aren't the votes coming out of Detroit. Those aren't the votes coming out of Milwaukee. But those are the votes coming out of Utah. Those are the votes coming out of Wyoming. Those are the votes coming out of the villages. And so that's where that whole thing about not valuing Black representation, that's where that comes from. And think about how many times that person that's in the White House right now has called Black representatives low IQ. That is where that denigration of Black people comes from. That denigration of Black representation comes from. We see it coming through in terms of the policies. We see it coming through in the language. We see it coming through in the way things are framed. So the protection of white representatives is more important than Black people having the ability, the opportunity to choose their own representatives. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Here it has.
So I will say, Professor Anderson, it's taken everything in me not to just yell out preach as you're going through. Like we're in church at this point. So, folks, with that in mind and everything you've laid down, how did we even get here? So, Professor Crenshaw, I want to come back to you because you give us one answer to this question in Backtalker, your memoir that's dropping tomorrow, but you show us the devastating cost of intersectional failure. Especially regarding Clarence Thomas.
Mhm.
Mm.
Sometimes it's just a visceral reaction when you say his name.
You
Woo!
just have to,
You just have to
sort of
breathe.
set within yourself. Well,
Woo!
so let me build into that from what both Carol and Tim have said. There is the failure to see intersectionality in the relationship between uh, protecting incumbency and protecting white power when those two things are effectively one and the same, and you're applying a sort of a falsely separate framework. There's racial, gerrymandering and political, when our history tells us that these two things right now are one and the same. So first of all, you have the way that the court actually tries to disentangle something that is mutually constituted. But the second thing is that they do it on the other side as well, in undermining what a minority vote dilution actually looks like. So, a long-standing debate between the progressives on the court and the conservatives was on how to go about proving that Black people were losing their existing power because they were being outvoted, overvoted by white voters. And one of the signals of what was to come was the conservatives saying, we have to do regression analysis to determine whether the reason that Black folk and white folks choose different things was solely because of phenotype,
Mm.
not because of all the things that are part of historically being situated as a racially marginalized group. So, according to these folks, Black voters might choose different people because they're not homeowners, because they don't have high educational attainment, because they happen to live, next to toxic waste dumps. And to the conservatives, this meant that wasn't about race. It was about all this other stuff. But race is about all that other stuff. That's what it means to say race is socially constructed. It's not about, the melanin in our skin. It's about the way that power has been constituted to repeatedly place us in subordinate positions with respect to pretty much every distribution of good things and bad things in society. So, yeah, that creates mutuality in their choices that should be considered racially infused choices. But this court has long tried to say the only thing that counts as racism is if we say we're doing it because we don't like you, and the only reason we have different choices is because of the color of your skin, which of course is ridiculous. Now, how did we get to the point that this Supreme Court was in the position to wreak havoc on the civil rights movement? And what do Black choices have to do about it? And this is where it gets really uncomfortable, because the assault on the Voting Rights Act was first successful, or became successful in this modern era, because of a 5-4 decision in Shelby County. Who was that fifth vote? Clarence Thomas.
Thomas.
Clarence Thomas. How did Clarence Thomas get on the Supreme Court? Well, one, a right wing administration named him to the Supreme Court. So that's how it got started. But he got confirmed after Anita Hill came forward, told her story about how she had been subject to sexual harassment. And because too many people in our community thought that she was being a traitor to intervene in the upward trajectory of an African American who couldn't care less about the Voting Rights Act, about Black folks' interests, about the long, long struggle, the blood, as you all were saying, that was shed to actually create these civil rights, couldn't care less about that. But the reflexive response of so many of folks in our community to the idea that, oh, well, he's saying this is a high-tech lynching, oh, well, she's trying to get in the way, was so powerful that it shifted support in the Black community to support Clarence Thomas. And I know for a fact that was a fundamental dimension of his being confirmed. Because when we were going to the Senate offices of individual senators who were elected in part because of the huge, huge registration drive that Jesse Jackson had done in the presidential campaign that he had pursued. Black folks were an incredibly important constituency in statewide races. And they were saying to us, to a person, how can I vote against Clarence Thomas when so many African Americans are saying, vote for him to be confirmed? He is our candidate. So how did this happen? Intersectional failure. Why was it he was seen as credible and she wasn't? Because we know the history of lynching. We don't know the history of how Black women were subject to sexual abuse since we arrived on these shores. We don't know that Black women were the plaintiffs in some of the foundational sexual harassment cases. We don't know that Rosa Parks got her start as a rape crisis supporter for Reese Taylor. So when we don't tell these histories, when we don't have an intersectional view to anti-racism and to feminism, we create this huge gap where two constituencies that could have come together to defeat this nomination were unable to. And now all of us are dealing with the horrific consequences of that mistake.
Thank you so much, Professor Crenshaw. What I thought of immediately when you said that was November 17th, 1991, when that full-page ad came out in the New York Times, African American women in
In
defense
defense
of
of ourselves.
It came right back to that. So while you get ready to read Backtalker, you gotta go and you can just pull that online and read that statement that helps to frame what Professor Crenshaw just laid out. So, folks, before we move to our final round, I want to uplift that many more of these brilliant insights that will cause you to be angry, that will cause you to feel sorrow, that will help you connect the dots to help you understand the mechanics of white supremacy, intersectionality, and how to fight back in this moment can be found by joining our upcoming Backtalkers Academy, our virtual summer school, and Backtalkers United, our book club, where you can find others who want to explore how we can use backtalk to save our democracy. If you're listening to this, you're joining us at this moment and wondering how you can equip yourself with the critical tools to understand this moment, I highly encourage you to sign up for the Backtalkers Academy. It's a virtual summer school. It kicks off on Wednesday, May 27th, runs through late June, and we're bringing together thinkers and practitioners and strategists from across the academy, media, politics, social justice, to lead all kind of interactive plenaries and workshops attending the academy. Now, that won't save you, but it will give you the tools you need to get out so we can save ourselves, help you make sense of the past, and help you work with us to secure our future. There are going to be some incredible voices, including our guest this afternoon, Professor Tim Wise, Carol Anderson, Kimberlé Crenshaw, in plenaries covering how backtalkers can reclaim critical race theory, historical memory, feminism, democracy, and education. And I will kick off each week with a homeroom, with a fabulous roster of guests, including Clint Smith, Ibram Kendi, Katie Paris, April Albright, Randy Weingarten, Brendan Mitchell, many of whom have been on this show with me. So you don't want to miss that. And for those of you who can sign up right now, you'll get access to a special code, Launch10. I repeat, Launch10. You can get you a very special discount in honor of tomorrow's Backtalker launch. And for those of you interested in starting or joining Backtalkers United, we must be clear that this is no ordinary book club. It's a call to action. It is so needed in this moment, designed to silence our dissent. And as such, we have an incredible list of resources on offer to help guide your community conversation. We have a comprehensive Backtalker syllabus. We have learning materials, a discussion guide. We have everything you need to turn your reading into actionable resistance. We also provide flexible execution options. So if you're going to meet once, twice, 4 times a month, every day, whatever moves you, we're going to be able to help you and drop those links right now. We want to add, of course, if you're in the Baltimore City area, Kimberlé Crenshaw is going to be here on Wednesday. She has given us a hit of 3 things on Wednesday. She'll be at Red Emma's at 12 o'clock in the afternoon for a lunchtime talk. She'll be on my show at 4 o'clock live in the studio. And then at 7:30, she'll be at Bird in Hand. We are so excited that in Baltimore City, we get the pleasure of being here when the book launched. So take a look at the whole schedule. If you're anywhere near, come on through. Let's talk Backtalker together. Now, for round three, how we fight back, our final round. This picture is sobering, but as we always say on Under the Blacklight, we are not going to leave you in despair without a plan for action. So, Kim, your book is titled Backtalker, an American memoir. And at this moment, with the courts actively working against us and trying to mandate our silence, I want to ask you, what does back talking to power look like? And how do we use the tools you've laid out to fight back? But before you go, I want to send a special thank you to the members who are listening on Today with Dr. K, who are going to break. You're going to have to go online to get the rest of this from the Backtalkers, as Kimberlé Crenshaw takes us into what does back talking to power look like to you?
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you to your listeners for being our ride or die in this moment of back talking. A lot of people say, why did you use back talker? Isn't it sort of a negative connotation? Back talking, you are stepping outside of the expected decorum in which you're supposed to engage those in authority and those in power. And I say precisely. The moment now is to resist power, to talk back to it, to tell MAGA power that we're not going to take this as though your ideology, your distortions, your effort to defame the vision, the aspirations, the sacrifice that got us here can be simply redefined by your name, by your choice, by your agency. We're doing everything possible to say, no, it ain't so. We're not bending the knee. We're not kissing the ring. We're not going to give up our history and our future. So back talking is simply the resistance, the refusal to take this lying down, the refusal to silence ourselves, the refusal to not fight back. So back talking involves asking the questions, resisting the definitions, making clear that we're not doing anticipatory compliance, which Timothy Snyder tells us is this idea that the right can figure out how far we're going to go by what we allow ourselves to do without even being called to do it. Trust that there's going to be another demand on us to throw others under the bus or to give up our language or give up our homes, to allow our ideas to be gentrified by the ideas of those who have never supported us, the faction of society that would rather break this country rather than share it, and still thinks that this country is exclusively theirs. So to back talk, we have to know this history. We have to have the attitude that suggests your authority over me is not constituted just because you think you have the power to force me to kiss the ring. And lastly, back talking involves community. None of us can do this alone. None of us would be able to have this conversation without you, Kay, and without you, Carol, and without you, Tim. We've got to learn a lesson from how we bring all of our perspectives together to resist what it is they're trying to get us to do, which is to go silently into that good night. I ain't going nowhere. And I know everybody else on this call ain't going nowhere either.
I love that. I love the title Backtalker because I grew up being told by my mother, "Don't you backtalk me." But I may have been quiet, but I was still backtalking inside.
In my head.
Quiet the backtalker. And to me, that is the essence of this book. We need to backtalk to those in power and take our power back. Tim, I want to come to you first, and then Carol, in 1 minute, if you can give us your final backtalking marching orders.
Well, I agree with everything Kim said, obviously, but as a Southerner, let me add something to this. I think we need to hit these folks where they live and start coming for what they care about. And let me tell you, as a Southerner, I know what that is. It's college athletics. I am dead serious. Yes, we need to push on lawmakers. We need to get out to vote, pack the court if we can, but we need to be pressuring the NCAA. Do not let schools in states that are race black districts play in the college football playoff. The NCAA gets rich off black ball players, as do these schools. We should be shaming them into making a statement, much as they once did when they told the University of Illinois many years ago that they wouldn't be allowed to host a tournament game if they continued to have a horrible indigenous mascot. Let's get Big Ten schools and other non-Southern conferences to target the SEC and the ACC and the transfer portal and high school recruits with a very simple message to black athletes who make these colleges rich. Do not play where your votes don't count. Come to Michigan, come to Oregon, come to Ohio State, assuming Ohio doesn't do something stupid. Come to USC, come to UCLA, come to Indiana or Notre Dame, assuming they don't do something stupid. Come to Virginia, come to Wisconsin. Let's pressure ESPN, which is owned by Disney. Don't have college game day on Saturdays on any campus in a state where lawmakers move to dilute the black vote. Because I assure you, if lawmakers in those states think that that is a serious risk, they will rethink. They care about football more down here than they care about their own mamas. So I am dead serious that that kind of pressure campaign has got to be part of the back talking that we do.
Thank you so much, Tim Wise. I'm going to come to you, Professor Carol Anderson. In 1 minute, very quickly, your back talking advice for us.
I think it's absolutely essential that we make sure that we're registered to vote, and that we come out in numbers too big to rig. So we show, because one of the key elements that voter suppression is designed to do is to make you think it's hopeless, is to make you cede your power, CED, is to make you believe that there's nothing that you can do. By showing up to vote in mass, you show them you're flexing your power. You show them that there are consequences to acting a fool. There are consequences for trying to take away my right to vote. There are consequences for trying to deny me my citizenship rights. You will feel the power. You will feel the pain at the ballot box. And so that's what we have to do. So we have to work together. We have to make sure that we're getting folks registered to vote. We have to make sure that they understand what are the rules about IDs and absentee ballots, and where your polling place is, and that we have to make sure that we can get folks to their polling places, because what we also know is that a lot of these states have shut down polling places in Black communities, which has increased the distance. And so we have to work with our organizations and in our communities to make sure that folks vote, because it is that power of the vote, just like it is with football. It is that power of the vote where they look up and they're going, "Oh, Shaggy." They have their Scooby-Doo moments. And so we need to make sure that they have their Scooby-Doo moments.
I love that. What a powerful and urgent conversation. Thank you so much, Carol Anderson. Thank you, Tim Wise. Thank you, Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw, for bringing the fire and the facts today. And a big congratulations again to Professor Crenshaw for the release of her timely memoir tomorrow, along with a special announcement. I was the first to say it. Happy birthday. Yes, Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw is celebrating 2 birthdays tomorrow. The birth of that baby Backtalker and her own special birthday. So folks, as we close out tomorrow, today, remember the mandate. It's a couple of things. We cannot bend the knee. We must be the generation that talks back, that organizes, that protects the multiracial democracy our ancestors bled for. Please make sure to get your copy of Backtalker. Sign up to join Backtalkers United. Register for Backtalkers Academy. Follow Professor Crenshaw on her book tour. To get tickets, visit KimberlyCrenshaw.com. Get your Backtalkers t-shirt. Don't miss the Backtalkers episode of Intersectionality Matters podcast. It's dropping tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for standing with us, and keep back talking. They can silence you on the outside. Find every measure you can to keep speaking up. Thank you again to all of you, and thank you everyone for joining us.